How's everyone doing today? I hope you are not as jet lagged as I am. I am absolutely exhausted. I flew out of Tokyo Sunday morning and I'll arrive back in Appalachia late Sunday night. And I'm still horribly jet lagged and I'm trying to normalize my awake, or what is it, circadian cycle or whatever. Only I have to be in up north Alaska. I'm leaving for on Friday for that. So wife wasn't happy when I told her about that. So I'm assuming most of my audience knows about this podcast that apparently Pat did. And I'm showing the link and everything on the screen. I'm not going to play the whole podcast because I don't think anybody wants to sit there listening to Pat's voice this entire time. But I did download the podcast because I had, I don't know, 20 plus hours of flight time. So I was listening to it and I was taking notes in my notebook about it, and I figured I'd share some things, some observations that I made. So the first thing I noticed was I'd say a good half of the podcast has nothing to do with Pat's trolls whatsoever. It really felt like that this was just an excuse for Pat to puff up his background and make some claims about himself and his family, while at the same time driving the knife into the back of his ex-wife and the guy that raised Pat's daughter's real father. Pat doesn't seem to be able to let go of anything. I just thought it was kind of weird that how the podcast kind of went. But I did notice when he first started off, he talked about his dad being a rodeo bull rider or whatever, celebrated rodeo bull rider, which of course there's no evidence of that. The other thing he claimed about his dad, which I thought was really interesting, was he called his dad a master electrician in the state of Wisconsin. And this is a prime example that a lot of braggarts run into. They make like a claim like that, and they don't really realize what they're saying. And what I mean by this is for Pat's father to be a master electrician in the state of Wisconsin, like a lot of U.S. states, his father would have to have a bachelor's, at the very least, a bachelor's in electrical engineering or a master's in electrical engineering. I have a very hard time believing that if Pat's father had either one of those two degrees, he wouldn't just be talking about it nonstop. Talked about how there was only one intersection in his entire town, or stoplight in his entire town of 12,000 people. I call BS on that. I guarantee you there's at least three or four railroad crossings, and they're going to have lights and stuff. So that's a load of crap. He also talked about how, like, if he wanted to call his nearest neighbor, that he had to make a long distance phone call. I don't think Pat understands the difference between a long distance phone call and just using a different area code. I'm from Maryland, and I think Maryland now is up to like 6 area codes. So just because I'm calling somebody from a different area code doesn't mean I'm making a long distance phone call. I did notice when he's talking about his childhood, he mispronounced cloistered. He pronounced it cloitered, which was weird to me. It's got an S in it. And then he said something about it. Both his parents try to encourage our better natures, meaning him and his younger brother. I don't know if that was meant to be a stab at his younger brother or not. Talked about how he didn't get along with kids. He got along better with adults because of his ADHD, which I have a hard time believing any adult likes being around a child with ADHD. What I suspect probably was his people of his age group were more likely to just call him out on his antisocial behavior, whereas adults tended to put up with it more. Talked about how he never applied himself in school, but he busted the curve on the exams. I just have to point out the fact that if he was busting the curves on the exams, there's no reason for him to have a 1.7 GPA. That's a shockingly low GPA. The average GPA for a high school student in America right now is like 3.0. I think around when Pat went to school, it's probably like around a 9.6, 2.96 or 2.98. Like Pat wouldn't have been able to enlist in the military with me. He would have had to get in a waiver for every single one of his D's, and he would have to get so many waivers that I don't think the military would have bothered with him. He talks about going to college. I'm fairly certain he went to community college, if he did go to college. The fact that he never mentions the name of his college or anything, or his degree, makes me think that he never actually graduated. Talked about how at his 2 year point in college, he got a crazy great job offer with a friend from a friend's uncle to move to, was it Tampa Bay or something? I think it was Tampa Bay. And he was supposed to be able to make like $100,000 a year within a year. Um, Unless he was moving drugs, which I don't think he was. I suspect that this was some kind of cold calling, mixed level marketing kind of thing, which I think he still does now. I think he literally calls old people in Florida and sells them insurance that they don't need. I think that's what he's always been doing, and he works on some kind of commission. I would say that he's a scumbag. I will say there's one thing that impresses me, and I could be wrong on this, but it sounds like he bought his car in Florida. And if it's the same Mustang, I am outright impressed. Primarily because cars in Florida don't get the undercoating. So he either paid for the undercoating or he washes his car like literally like every other day. Because the salt will just destroy your car. I knew plenty of guys in the military that bought cars down in the south and then they got stationed up north. And, after the winter, they go to get in their car and their transmission just falls out of the bottom of their pickup truck or whatever. Talks about his ex for a while, talks about the divorce, says something like he didn't even understand the divorce. And it's like, what do you, is the concept of a divorce like too esoteric for you? Like, what do you not understand? He really shit talks his wife and the dead guy. Never mentions his arrest though when he talks about going to a dark place. Pretty much sounds like he used stand-up audiences as free captive therapists for a while, and then 2012 he made probably the worst mistake in his life. He created his Twitter account. It's absolutely amazing how much detail he can go into about that stupid quote unquote thought experiment that he ripped off from somebody. Which again, that thought experiment, I think I've talked about it before, is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Excuse me, I'm drinking water. I'm still sick as a dog. I don't know if I sound different, but the vibrations in my head completely feel different. Let's see. Pat thinks his hot takes online are activism. He thinks Norm was canceled, which he wasn't, and supposedly his tweet, "I never found Norm funny," was supposed to be standing up against racism and sexism. Then he went into this weird area where, like, it sounded like he was pointing out the fact that the pests ruined Anthony Acumia's career, and they got him canceled. Which I never watched the O&A, or I'm sorry, listened to the O&A show, and I probably never will. The only thing I know about Anthony Acumia is from my Twitter feed, because inexplicably I get his tweets from my Twitter feed, and he just comes off as a very, very old, racist, sexist, homophobic boomer. So I don't know why Pat would have a problem with him being canceled, but apparently he does. Then Pat, he mentioned this a couple of times. He really seemed upset by the fact that the pests seem to successfully go after him, but they don't go after other richer, more successful people. He brought up that guy. What's his name? Crap, I can't think of his name. Where the pests tried to start a rumor that he killed his first wife, and Pat's like Patton Oswalt. And he's like, Patton, like, they couldn't go after Patton Oswalt because he has some money to fight back. And it's like, no, they stopped going after him because they got bored because Patton Oswalt never acknowledged anything about them in any of the things that he said or they said. Pat talks about how he was doxed his home address, yet he himself is the one that posted his home address. I know of at least twice he has posted his own address online, and I'm fairly certain those tweets are still up. Let's see. He believes in gang stalking, which is really weird. He used false DMCA claims to strike fair use content on the internet, and he seems to be really, really proud of that. I firmly believe the only reason that Reddit actually finally just started uh, kicking people and stuff, the admins closed down the subreddit because they were sick of his spam. Apparently, Pat got cucked by a mod. He said something. Where is it? Yeah, he said that he knows how to deal with trolls. And dealing with trolls is easy. All you have to do is just, say your piece and block them, which it blows my mind that he can actually say that and believe it because I've never once seen him actually do that. He still harasses me from behind a block nonstop. He proudly claims he broadcasts his life 24/7 online, doesn't understand why this is dangerous. That's a note I put. I also put a note. He must be the only person in the U.S. that answers his cell phone for unknown number. Then he says the stalker children film themselves committing crimes, yet for some reason he's not able to get them arrested for anything. Pat sees no difference between online life and real life, which is terrifying to me. Says he misses the old internet. I, I think Pat has rose tinted glasses or something. If he doesn't realize that the old internet was just as bad as the current internet in a lot of ways. He says the trolls steal his information and make up stories to justify their actions. It literally sounds like Pat to me. Him and his wife have CPTSD, which is a shame. Like, legitimately, I feel bad for both of them in some ways. I do believe that Pat, for whatever reason, can't control his behavior and modify it. I think he might have some form of personality disorder. Speaking of which, he brings up sociopaths. And the way Pat describes sociopaths is just flat out wrong. Also, we don't use that term sociopath anymore, it's lost all meaning. The proper term is antisocial personality disorder. So, just going a little bit into detail about this, like Pat describes how, like back in the day, sociopaths would be successfully isolated from society. They wouldn't be able to come together and just harass him online. I'm fairly certain that out of all the Pat posters out there, and I'm barely a Pat poster, I have to take breaks from Pat all the time. I'm probably the only one of any of the people that interact with Pat that has been clinically diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder. Now, I want to be very, very clear. There's all different kinds of subgroups within there. And of course, people kind of fit into different groups and stuff. So, like, you have like your nomadic. Um, I'm going to just use the term sociopath, even though it's not the correct term, just because it's shorter. But you have like your nomadic sociopaths. Those are like the homeless guys that are homeless and such. They can't handle being around other people. They like to isolate themselves. Then you have your malevolent sociopaths. Those are like the sadists, serial killers, the serial rapists, and so on. They tend not to last long at all. They usually die by suicide or die by cop. Then you have like your risk takers. These are people that are intentionally doing risky behavior to, you know, for whatever reason they don't see an issue with taking risks that normal people wouldn't take. And then you have your like abrasive, your tyrannical, your disingenuous, and so on. You have your reputationalists. These are people that really care about their reputation. They'll do anything to maintain their reputation, no matter what. They'll lie, cheat, and steal. So, like a prime example of a reputationalist sociopath would be Bernie Madoff. He's a clear-cut definition of one. And that's the other thing. Like Pat describes sociopaths as being very, very unsuccessful in life. It's not necessarily true. Of course, there are plenty of homeless sociopaths that are in no way, shape, or form successful. But if you wanted to compare me and Pat, I'm light years ahead of him by far, by far. Ultimately, the big thing with sociopaths, we're not really created by, or we're not born. There is no like mental disease that causes this. There's no real genetics, although there's been a little bit of research into that. For the most part, we are created typically by very, very traumatic, messed up childhoods. Not always, but oftentimes. So this is one of the reasons why I tend to unnerve people when I interact with them. I don't smile. I don't pick up on social cues very well. I will work with you at a steel, like for example, a lot of times what ends up happening, I'll be at a steel mill for like 2 weeks and I haven't talked to anyone. And eventually somebody will ask me like, "Hey man, do we have a problem or something?" They'll be like, "Oh no, I'm autistic," and that usually gets them to leave me alone. Because if I tell them I have antisocial personality disorder, that starts to raise some eyebrows, kind of thing. The big thing is it's just I don't really have emotions, and when I do have emotions, I tend not to necessarily be able to regulate them too well. It doesn't mean that I'm incapable of emotions, not at all. I just I generally just don't share emotions whatsoever. Around my wife and my kid, of course, I'm a completely different person. I put in a lot of effort and so on to be light, bubbly, interactive kind of thing. But when I'm away from both of them, I just shut down. I just, if I'm working at your steel mill or your port, I cannot be bothered to give a shit about your feelings. It's too exhausting for me. But then again, that doesn't mean that I'm unsuccessful or anything like that. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I had to blow my nose and I didn't want to do that like while I have a microphone on. That would just sound gross. So, if anything, Pat would probably prefer it if all of his harassers were sociopaths. Because, like I always say, I have to take breaks from Pat because I find him so exhausting. And there's things that I just don't get out of people. I don't understand people that are emotionally invested in the election. It's so foreign and alien to me. I just can't be bothered to give a shit either way. And there's a lot of things like this. But again, that doesn't mean that I don't care and love for my wife and my son. Like, oh, I'll put you in the ground if you threaten them, kind of thing. But like, I have to think about things very, very analytically. I can't think about things emotionally because it just doesn't make any sense. So, like, if I'm watching my son play soccer with a bunch of other kids, and the parents were all sitting in the bleachers, and one of the parents is just yelling out swear words, uh, I can't think, well, I can't get up, go over there, and just break the guy's jaw and just brutally beat him in front of his kids and stuff. No, I can't do that because that would harm the kids emotionally and so on, and that'd be a bad thing to do. The way I have to think about it is I don't want to do that because I'll get arrested. If I get arrested, I can't be around my wife and my kid. I have to think, it's weird, but I have to think analytical more than emotional. But we tend to suffer with remorse and stuff. We also tend to be pretty difficult to treat. And one of the reasons is sociopaths, we tend to be very good at manipulating people and very good at faking emotions because we have to learn how to do that. But again, this is one of the reasons why I can talk about like horrific injuries and stuff that have happened to me. My dad beating out all my teeth and stuff like that, and I don't get emotional because I just don't have emotions. And it's not like I don't run into issues between me and my wife over this. For example, my wife is adamant that I need to try to reconnect with my birth parents before they die because she thinks that it's really going to mess me up if I don't make that effort before they pass away. And for my wife, she struggles to understand that I don't feel anything towards them. I don't feel hatred. I don't feel rage. I don't have love, abandonment, or anything. I just don't because they got beaten out of me when I was like 7 years old. But again, Pat's talking about stuff that he doesn't like. Let's see. I wrote here, cops don't like Pat. I also wrote, Pat is livid that as a white man, he is being treated like a black man. And Pat demands the Milwaukee police set new policies. Vice Pat just stopped posting his life online. He's still taking credit for the Patti LaBelle swatting. They took away our sanctuary, says a man that invites the entire world into his home every day. I wrote it down again. Pat thinks he's trolled because he's poor. Our network has shrunk. I do feel bad for Pat and his wife in a way that I'm sure it's very isolating. Like people have just distanced themselves from them. But I think the primary reasons they've distanced themselves is I'm sure Pat is incredibly abrasive to people when they suggest like, hey, have you ever thought about like not posting everything online, not feeding the trolls, and so on. He talked about the lawsuit. He's still angry at Section 230, and he has no idea how it works and why it's important. Like if we didn't have Section 230, Pat would not be allowed on the internet. He wouldn't be allowed to post anything anywhere. He complains that he can't commit crimes against his perceived enemies. Still won't consider not feeding the trolls. Pat brings up the FBI and the justice system, how they failed them, but he never mentions any of the arrests involving TOR/SWAT. So, and those were just my thoughts. So this is a quickie little video. I always apologize. I don't really make contact too much. It's just one of those things that when I try to make contact, I try to appear normal to you guys. I try not to unnerve people, and I do find it pretty exhausting. Again, when I'm around my wife and my kid, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier. Whereas when I'm by myself, I just can't be. Half the time, I forget to put my teeth in, so like the whole right side of my face is sunken in, and then like I will just start playing my tongue, around the open hole that I have on my cheek, and it just really grosses people out. I won't even realize that I'm doing it. One of the things I like about when I work jobs like in China, South Korea, and Japan and stuff, and even India, nobody tries to talk to me, which makes it a lot easier for me. But I'm weird. I know I'm weird. Um, I don't hide it. I don't think intentionally try to hide it. I don't really talk to people outside of my family about it, and my family is just my wife and my kid, really. My kid knows I'm screwed up. My wife, of course, obviously knows I'm screwed up. So, but I've gotten really really good at I zone in on them constantly whenever I'm around them to make sure that my behavior is not. Because the thing is, it's not like I'm violent or crazy or nothing. What'll happen is like people will just start talking to me, and I will just not even realize it, and they could be looking right at me, and I just don't notice it. Or they'll tell a joke. I'm supposed to laugh, and it won't click in my head, and it can unnerve people, and I don't mean to. But yeah, it's just funny to me. Like Pat thinks that all his trolls are like all sociopaths, and again, I think I'm probably the only one, and that we're all unsuccessful weirdo loners, and we don't do anything with our life. Which, like Pat, if we're trying to be more successful than you, it's kind of a low bar there, brother. Really low bar. I like if almost anyone can have a kid and be allowed to have contact with them, or just hold a job and whatever. I still maintain that if Pat went to see a psychiatrist or a therapist, they would probably advise him to like, hey, why don't you take a break from the internet? It's probably good for you. And he doesn't want to do that because that's exactly what they'll say. I think both him and his wife absolutely need therapy because I do think they're being tormented, but I think they're primarily being tormented by Pat's own actions. So it's a miserable life to live. I know if it was my situation was like somehow remotely close to this, I would completely change my behavior. I would quit my job for my wife and my son, and I absolutely love my job because I can be left alone for long periods of time, and I can make a lot of money doing that. But I digress. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're not dealing with sleep issues like I am. Y'all take care. Ciao.